evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome back to Vampire Reviews, where we are breaking down each episode of AMC's Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire Season 2 to examine how the show was adapted from the books it's based on. Yes, these 7 books specifically, this episode at least. What did the show keep? What did it change? What did it delete entirely? And what does that mean? How does this alternate universe, alternate timeline version of the story distinguish itself from the source material? What are the new vampire metaphors and messages it creates that speak to us now in the 2020s compared to how the themes of the stories hit when the books came out in the 1970s and 80s? When Anne Rice wrote Interview with a Vampire in 1973, popular media had never seen vampires of this kind before. Vampires who are truly evil monsters, who kill people every single night, yet also have depth of feeling and struggle with morality and philosophy the way humans do and can empathize with. But now, 50 years later, every single vampire you see is influenced by Anne Rice in some way, either by taking inspiration from her ideas or by rebelling against them. Name one that isn't. Just try. So what does AMC's television show do to make the very archetype of the modern era vampire unique, fresh, and engaging for a contemporary audience? And now for a word from our sponsors. Me! I'm sponsors. This video is sponsored by my Patreon patrons. Thank you all so much. This channel cannot exist without your support. If you would like to help me make these videos, join my Patreon. The link is in the description. That's it. See, that was easy. Tonight, we get to talk about episode 3. My favorite episode of the season so far. I haven't seen the last 2 yet. But I think you should know that my criteria for episode ranking directly correlates to the amount of Lestat content contained therein. As if there would be any better way to rank anything. Episode 10 is titled No Pain, which is another quote from Santiago's monologue in the play we saw last episode, where he plays the Grim Reaper and the vampires kill a woman on stage right in front of the audience with no one ever being the wiser. You already heard him say, no pain, last episode, and you'll hear him say it again, because unlike in the book, this theatre de vampire kills a new person on stage every single night. Every single night since 1796. That's almost 55,000 people who have died upon this stage. How did they get away with it? If this were the books, I would explain it by telling you that anytime the police come around to investigate the missing persons, the vampires would just hypnotize them into forgetting why they were there or make them believe there was nothing at all to worry about and they would go away. Vampire Jedi mind tricks. These are not the thousands of missing persons you're looking for. This is how Lestat, Louis, and Claudia lived in New Orleans for 65 years without anyone ever being suspicious of them. But if the vampires in the TV show had that power, then Louis and Lestat wouldn't have spent the entire 1920s underground because of all the bodies Claudia left for the police to find. Lestat would have just sent those cops in episode 5 away from their door the second they arrived. Kind of like exactly how he did with the soldiers in episode 3. So he still does have that power? Also, can't he freeze time? Absolutely not a thing vampires can do in the book, by the way. Why didn't he just freeze time in episode 5 to give Claudia more time to clean up her room? Shh, don't think too hard about it. The episode opens with Daniel on his lunch break, out to eat at a fancy sushi restaurant. Last year, some production photos appeared online that show set designs called Dubai Sushi. So we knew this scene was coming, but nothing about, who Daniel would be having lunch with. For the moment, he's alone, jotting down notes to try to work out some of the puzzles the vampires have weaved for him. He's written, "This time I won't save your life," which was what Armand said to him at the end of season 1.
This time I won't save your life.
Now remember, in the book, Louis and Armand are already broken up when Louis does the interview with Daniel in 1973. At the end of it, when Daniel begs Louis to make him a vampire, Louis is so enraged that he attacks Daniel and drains his blood, leaving him for dead. But miraculously, Daniel pulls through and recovers from the epic blood loss. He then immediately goes hunting for Lestat, but ends up finding Armand instead, and that's how they meet. Here in the show, though, Armand and Louis were still together during the first interview. So when Louis attacked Daniel, Armand saved Daniel from him instead of Daniel just surviving on his own. Maybe he would have still survived on his own if Armand hadn't saved him, but now this Daniel is intrigued as to why Armand would even want to save his life at all. Armand just told him last episode that he and Louis used to bring young men home for sex and then Armand would drain them for sport. Why would he stop Louis from doing that with Daniel? In the book, Armand took interest in Daniel as a link to Louis, the man he'd lost. And then he needed Daniel as like a guide to the modern world that he's unable to understand on his own. You know, like teach him how to use the telephone and set his VCR clock. But here in the show, Armand still had Louis and was already doing just fine in the modern world. So what could be his motivation this time for keeping Daniel alive? And how does that motivation connect to the flash of memory Daniel had last episode where Armand was telling him things about his childhood? Such a mystery. When his chef's choice lunch plate arrives with a live fish on it that Daniel's grossed out by, a man who's sitting next to him at the sushi bar starts rambling this metaphor about how risky it is to give up one's power to someone else's whims, and then he tells Daniel he's read his book. Daniel is nonplussed, but then this guy, played by Justin Kirk, reveals that he knows Daniel is interviewing vampires, and he's been hearing every word they say in Louis' apartment. He's hacked Daniel's laptop, he's got him bugged. Daniel thinks he's some government intelligence spy, but nope. This man is a field agent for the Talamasca. If you've watched season 1 of AMC's Anne Rice's Mayfair Witches, which shares a universe with the vampires, you have already been introduced to the Talamasca. But if you haven't, think about them as like this universe's X-Files. They are a secret, global, private, extremely private organization of paranormal investigators, but they have a strict non-involvement policy with the preternatural. Their motto is, "We watch, and we are always there." They are librarians and scholars who have been collecting and archiving information on vampires, ghosts, spirits, mummies, witches, and werewolves for centuries. They have mother houses in London, Amsterdam, New Orleans. Everyone who works for the Talamasca has some sort of psychic or magical power of their own. And many can read minds just as well as any vampire. There are several prominent members of the Talamasca who feature in both the Vampire Chronicles and The Lives of the Mayfair Witches, linking the two series over the years so that by the early 2000s, they became inseparable and are basically just one big 18-book series by the end. So yeah, all of you who have been inspired to start reading the books because you love this show, make sure you read all 18 of them in order. We've discussed this. It's not 13 books. First of all, there's 15 books in the Vampire Chronicles. People seem to always want to forget 2 of them. It's really 18 books. You need the witches. In the books, the Talamasca are much more low-tech than this guy talking to Daniel seems to be. More like an ancient order of monks, who also happen to be psychic detectives. And all they're interested in is knowledge, not trying to stop the monsters from being monsters. Contact with the vampires especially is strictly prohibited for everyone's safety. Mr. Talamasca here tells Daniel that over the past month, the world's vampire population has gone from 900 to 1600, reminding us of the great conversion that has been mentioned several times before, an organized vampire scheme that is using the political unrest of COVID in 2022 to increase their numbers so that vampires can then conquer Earth? Profit? In the books, there is a similar population boom of vampires in the 1980s, but it's not any kind of like organized plot. It's just that with the modern world making it easier than ever for vampires to get by, most of them are surviving and making other vampires. And by the time Lestat puts out his book in 1985, there are like tens of thousands of them the world over. This is a problem because all vampires are connected to the original vampire, Akasha. an ancient Egyptian queen. She's been comatose for thousands of years, but the reason she became a vampire in the first place was that a bloodthirsty spirit entered her body and transformed her on a cellular level. This spirit, he has a name, it's Amel, is made up of some undiscovered form of matter, mysterious nanoparticles that take the shape of invisible tentacles. And every time a new vampire is made, a tentacle stretches out from Akasha, like interdimensionally, to the vampire. So all vampires in the world are connected by this giant invisible web. The more vampires there are, the more thin the spirit tentacles are stretched, and the more dispersed its power. Amel has a finite amount of power, so that new vampires become weaker and weaker until eventually, in 1985, nobody can even make them anymore. They all turn out bad, like the Revenant we saw in episode 1, or don't survive the transformation at all. In order to solve this problem and get his power more concentrated again, the spirit of Amel wakes Akasha up from her millennia of sleep, and she goes on a mass killing spree to bring the vampire population back down to a manageable level. At first, the surviving vampires think that there's merely dozens of them left, but turns out later it was more like a couple thousand, but still much less than the tens of thousands there were before Akasha exploded everyone. The show seems to have greatly diminished that number. Obviously, the Talamasca can't be tracking all the vampires, especially the ones who have been sleeping in the earth for years, so 900 is only a certain percentage of them, but proportionally increasing to tracking 1600 1 month later still doesn't seem like that many. I'm curious to find out why the show made this change. If I had to guess, my guess is that there being tens of thousands of vampires in the world is like bad for the world in general, right? But since they all lived in hiding, in the book, they're doing minimal possible damage. But since in the show, the vampires are actually plotting to take over the world or whatever, going up against more than 1,600 of them in a direct battle would be more than humanity could handle. The show is planning for some future epic showdown where 1,600 vampires will be actively wreaking havoc. So, let's keep some economy in our planning. We knew back in season 1 that the Great Conversion was obviously leading up to Akasha's storyline, which is in the 3rd book in the series, Queen of the Damned, which part of it takes place concurrently with book 2, The Vampire Lestat. So, if the show gets renewed, we might be seeing all of that coming out in season 3. And as Louis told us, he wants to do this interview now to get his story out there. In this book, Daniel will write so that the humans in the world can be better prepared to understand vampires once all the vampires from the Great Conversion decide to reveal themselves. And in the sushi restaurant, Mr. Talamasca is telling Daniel that it's all very real. He says 4 other people have tried to put vampire stories out into the world to educate people, and all of them ended up either dead or vampires themselves, and the stories never got published. Daniel asks his name, and when he gets it, he immediately assumes it's got to be a fake name. That's because the name is Raglan James. This is a character from the books, but he was a very different person from who we see Justin Kirk playing so far. He was very briefly, a member of the Talamasca, recruited thanks to his great psychic power, but he never worked on anything involving vampires. Vampires are kept secret from most of the Talamasca members, and only a select few high-ranking agents get to know about them. James was a compulsive thief, so he used his mind-reading ability to steal from the Talamasca archives, so he got kicked out of the order pretty fast. One of the things he stole, though, was information about vampires, so that's how he knows about them when he enters the picture in the 4th book, The Tale of the Body Thief. But he never formally worked with them like he seems to be doing here in the show. He was only like a junior member, and only for a very short time. This version of Raglan James is obviously a much higher-ranking official of some kind and trusted enough by the organization to be privy to this extremely privileged information. He could just be another random Talamasca member using an alias like Daniel accuses him of, and then the show just picked Raglan James as a fun Easter egg. For one thing, he's much younger than James is in the book, and he's got an American accent, not the posh boarding school British accent of the OG James. But this wouldn't be the first time that the show has dramatically changed a character, and the showrunners did say in one of their panels that this season is setting up for the eventual Tale of the Potty Thief story arc, so I don't think they'd use his name for someone else's alias if the real Raglan James was going to show up later. If he is indeed the real Raglan James and still has his phenomenal level of psychic power, he could be hearing everything Daniel's thinking right now, and that's how he knows so much about him, but he would not have been able to hear what was going on all the way up in Louis's apartment, so he must also have the place bugged. James's other main skill, besides being a lifelong master thief and con man, is astral projection. Something only super powerful psychics and extremely powerful vampires can do. Remember this for later. In the book, despite his great power, the other members of the Talamasca were much more powerful, so they caught him pretty fast and kicked him out of the order with dishonorable discharge. But apparently that has not happened yet here in the show, and he's now working for them in new, unexpected ways, which makes me think the show has made him a much better con man and more powerful psychic than he ever was in the book. He tells Daniel that he's hacked into his laptop and provided him with all the Talamasca's files connected to Louis and Armand. Aw, how nice! Yes, Raglan James is a bad guy in the book, but the Talamasca is not. The Talamasca is generally good and helpful, so he could just actually be being nice here. But Daniel feels threatened, so he starts shouting in the restaurant and James leaves. One note before we move on, when rumors started spreading months ago that Justin Kirk was cast in the season with a role that could be recurring in future seasons, much of the fandom somehow concluded that that must mean he would be playing Marius, the 2,000-year-old vampire who was Armand's maker. I never agreed with that theory because I just didn't think Marius would be showing up in this season. Armand does tell Louis very briefly about Marius in the book, but it's such a short little moment that I didn't think it would be worth it for the show to film this full-blown flashback to Armand's life with him in Renaissance Venice. Imagine the costume and set budget for that alone. No, not worth it for a 2-minute flashback. But maybe next season, when Armand tells Lestat his life story in much more detail. Yeah, the premise of this show is interviews, so we have a lot of talking heads telling us instead of showing, but I can hold out hope for more flashbacks. But since the show was so very serious about keeping Justin Kirk's character identity this huge secret, I can see why people were thinking it was going to turn out to be this big important vampire character like Marius. But now that we know who he is, I'm not sure why it was such a huge deal to keep it secret. It's cool that we're seeing a major Book 4 character be incorporated into the story already, even though he's essentially an entirely different person now to be involved with vampire intelligence the way he is here. But he's not anyone to make a big deal out of regarding Louis and Armand or anything about their story. Anyway, when the season 2 soundtrack dropped a couple weeks ago, there was a track on it titled Raglan James, and that combined with how obviously Kirk is playing a Talamasca member in the trailers, the fandom figured it all out on their own anyway. But I wouldn't have even called it a spoiler. What is it spoiling? That the show is going to do plots from the books? Well, I sure hope it is. Introducing a Talamasca member here is also serving as setup for the third Anne Rice series AMC is developing that is based entirely on the Talamasca. That one might have some characters from the Vampire and Witch books, but overall, it will have to be completely original new stories, as Anne Rice never actually wrote a Talamasca series. But the universe she developed is so rich that it offers a broad sandbox for writers to create new stories in. I personally am hoping that the Talamasca series is a fun detective procedural show. Huge missed opportunity, if not. Oh my gosh, imagine if it takes place during the time that Merrick is a member of the Talamasca. How cool would that be to see her? You guys don't know who I'm talking about. Back in Louis' apartment in Dubai, he is sleeping the day away like the proper vampire he is, so Daniel is left alone in the reading room with Armand and Real Rashid. Daniel starts grilling him about being a human servant to vampires and how the vampires can possibly keep secret from the mortals. He understands how the extremely wealthy ones like Louis and Armand can do it, but how do the rest of the 99% get by in this modern technological age without breaking the masquerade? How do they not get caught on surveillance cameras? How do they hide from Google and the cloud? These questions are actually what inspired Anne Rice to write the first of the last 3 books in the Chronicles, the Prince Lestat trilogy. She had said years ago that Blood Canticle, the 12th book in the series, would be the last vampire book she ever wrote. At the time, she was going through some religious crisis of faith and felt guilty about writing evil creatures. So she renounced them and started writing fan fiction about Jesus instead, and then some detective novels about angels. After she got over these struggles with Catholicism and returned to her own idea of what felt right and good for her lifestyle, she started writing about werewolves. Werewolves have always been mentioned as existing in the shared universe with the vampires and witches, but she never used them in any books before now. But yeah, werewolves were the new hot thing. She was still over vampires. Until one day she was just thinking about how Lestat and friends would deal with cell phones and cameras and keeping their secret in this modern world. Thus, Prince Lestat was born, and the fans rejoiced. All our favorite vampires were back, along with some new ones. The ultimate conclusion to the question was that humans are just so convinced that magic isn't real, that superstition has no place in our world anymore, that a vampire could be right in front of you and your mind would come up with an excuse to explain it away as something natural. The human mind just cannot bring itself to accept the idea of real vampires. And so the vampires can hide in plain sight, and then with their hypnotic powers, they can get away with murder every night and never get caught. None of the vampires in the books have really ever feared human vampire slayers. It's only other vampires who have ever posed danger to them. The vampires have always had strict secrecy rules about not revealing their nature to mortals. That's why Armand says Louis telling Daniel his story now is essentially committing suicide because they'll all come destroy him for doing it. But in the books, Lestat makes a huge point of telling the entire world that vampires are real, and he is one, and every single secret about vampires that ever existed. He does this by becoming a world-famous rock star, and still, no one believes him. Aside from the Talamasca, of course, they know everything. The other vampires are pissed off at Lestat, of course, and try to stop him, but not one single human ever poses a threat to him. He got away with that in the 1980s, and it's exactly the same way in the 21st century. When asked what books the show is incorporating this season, besides mentioning The Vampire Lestat, Queen of the Damned, The Vampire Armand, Tale of the Body Thief, the showrunners also mentioned Prince Lestat, and this question of how vampires fare in a world full of cell phones and internet where information never disappears is what they meant about how Prince Lestat fits into this season. The conclusion of Prince Lestat is that even if Real Rashid and the other employees of the Dubai house were to betray the vampires and go public and tell the world everything, no one would ever believe them. In this book, we hear tell of scientists who know vampires are real and try to prove it, presenting all kinds of convincing scientific evidence, but they only lose their careers as laughingstocks. The very popularity of the myth of the vampire is what keeps the real ones from ever being discovered or put in danger. But that's not even how Real Rashid answers the question at all anyway. He defends the vampires, saying killing people is their biological need, and it's not their fault their needs don't line up with human morality. And what even is morality anyway? Who makes these rules, and why do we have to agree to them? Oh yeah, Rashid's drunk the Kool-Aid. Now, I really wonder if he's hoping to become a vampire himself. Is that promise keeping him on the hook Nandermo style? He doesn't seem to care at all about the murder part, and he is unfailingly obedient. I kind of doubt it, though, because unless Louis and Armand are leading him on with lies, if the show sticks to the books, then Armand has never made another vampire in his whole life, and never wants to, would never curse another person with becoming a monster. And Louis feels the exact same way, would never want to bring more evil into this world, and only made one vampire once under extreme duress and the influence of mind control. So maybe real Rashid just thinks of it as serving a god, the way fake Rashid framed it for Daniel in season 1.
I serve a god. It is my honor to serve.
In the books in the modern era, during the Prince Lestat trilogy, Armand keeps this grand mansion in New York City where he employs human servants that he keeps in this perpetual state of brainwashedness to keep them silently docile and obedient in the background. But Rashid seems fully sharp and present here. No, he's got his own personal reasons for being loyal to Armand and Louis, and I really hope we get to find out what those are. Armand kicks Rashid out of the room, and Daniel asks him the same questions.
How do you hide from the cloud?
While Armand and Daniel talk, the camera keeps cutting back to Daniel's laptop screen, where his recording software picks up their voices in red squiggles. But when Armand says Louis will awaken when the sun sleeps, the camera shows us that there are no red floating squiggles on the screen. And I'm really not sure what's going on here. Someone else please explain to me. Is it supposed to be that Armand can pick and choose when the microphone can hear his voice or not? Or was it supposed to be that enough time had passed that the red marks are gone, and the reason the show is showing it to us with the white screen is emphasizing the awkwardness of this moment between Armand and Daniel? Neither of them comment on the lack of red squiggles, and I feel like if it was some kind of vampire magic trick, Daniel would be like, "Whoa, what's that? You can do that? Is that how you hide from the cloud?" But it doesn't actually end up going anywhere at all. Armand is being patient and polite here. He apologizes for how mean it was for Louis to make Daniel cry with reading his ex-wife trauma thoughts the previous day, and he's not at all responding to Daniel's rudeness with any hostility or antagonism. He even smiles at Daniel and seems to want to keep the peace, which is a bit of a shame because their whole bitch-off dynamic in the first episode was really fun, but hey, maybe this is the first step to them becoming friends down the line. Finally, Armand answers Daniel's question, starting off by saying that people's phones and such are only tracked by Google and Facebook in order to sell them things. So that kind of data retrieval would only affect them if, like, someone at Amazon was trying to sell them blenders. The fact that the example he uses is blenders is a fun nod to the book in Queen of the Damned during the years in the 70s and 80s when Daniel was the devil's minion, Armand's human pet, and Armand is all fascinated with changing technology. He goes through a phase where he is obsessed with blenders and makes the most horrifying smoothies based entirely on colors. The fandom likes to imagine that he forced Daniel to drink these smoothies. Armand is also obsessed with microwaves. He cooks rats and roaches in them, throwing all kinds of things down garbage disposals. Such a fun little weirdo gremlin, and long-suffering Daniel just had to go along with it all. But of course, we know that none of that happened between them in this version, so the show tossing in a mention of blenders is at least a cute little Easter egg of sorts. Armand tells Daniel how vampires exploit humanity's willful ignorance while they're all so obsessed with media as entertainment. And then he gives the credit for this idea to Lestat.
Lestat de Liancourt.
No, Daniel, the other Lestat. There is only one Lestat. Fun fact, Anne Rice made up the name Lestat entirely on her own. It never existed before. Originally, she was going to name him Lesson, which is an old French name and inspired by the name of her husband, Stan. But somehow or another, the N got replaced with a T, and she created one of the most iconic names in the history of fiction. But what does Lestat mean as a name, you wonder? And where did it come from? Well, as Lestat explains it, his mother just combined the first initials of each of his 6 older brothers' names into this anagram to make up the name, and it means absolutely nothing. Thanks, Mom. I guess by her 7th son, she was just that over it. Armand segues into a flashback sequence of the time he first met Lestat in the 1700s. In the book, this was in 1781, but the show has changed it to 1795-ish for some reason. Perhaps to coincide with Lestat's older age in the show so that they can still keep his original birthday, because in the book, he was made a vampire a week or 2 before his 21st birthday. But actor Sam Reed is portraying him as 34-ish in the show. Even though most of Armand's flashback sequence is taken straight out of Book 2, The Vampire Lestat. The first thing Armand tells Daniel is how the Roman branch of the satanic cult he was part of, the Children of Darkness, sent him up to become the leader of the Paris branch in 1556. And this is information from Book 7, The Vampire Armand, which gives the whole backstory of how Armand got brainwashed and indoctrinated into the satanic cult in the first place. In The Vampire Lestat, he does tell Lestat his whole life story, but he doesn't go into that much detail. And the 7th book in the series is when we get to hear the whole thing. Except that he didn't get sent from Rome to Paris in 1556 in the book. He was made a vampire in 1499 and then got kidnapped by the cult 10 months later and then sent up to Paris in 1501 when he was only 18 or 19 years old. Since Armand told us in season 1 that he was 514 years old in 2022, that means he was 48 years old this time when he became the leader of the Paris Coven, which is an interesting change. He was fully a man inside his mind with many years of experience in being a vampire. Good for a leader, you'd think, but in the book, the Rome cult wanted him to lead the Paris cult specifically because he was so young. Still this brand new baby vampire that he was full of all the teenage ego and zealotry with no wisdom of years to taint how viciously he would rule over the other vampires who were older than him, but not quite as powerful, as Armand was made by the ancient Marius's blood and much more powerful than the average vampire. Sending Armand up to Paris at the age of 48 leaves him room to have become jaded and weary, wise, and able to see through the bullshit of cult worship. That must have impacted his character development in significant ways. Another interesting thing, he calls the cult the Children of Darkness and not the Children of Satan. In the book, Children of Darkness is a term used for all vampires. It's just like another word for vampires. But the Children of Satan was the specific Christian cult of vampires with the holy mission to kill people in the name of God. It was their way of serving God, considering themselves the necessary evil and darkness in the world so that God's light could shine in contrast. So I was thinking that maybe the show took the Christian and satanic element out of the vampire cult, which might be a smart choice, considering Armand was acting like a practicing Muslim in season 1. And it's one thing to have a Christian satanic cult with a mission to slaughter people in God's name, but it's an entirely different look to have a Muslim vampire doing the same thing, and I wouldn't think the show would want to play into those harmful stereotypes about Islamic people. And when Armand describes how the Paris Coven lived in squalor, and we just see how downright disgusting and miserable they all are, he says the laws they follow are in place to protect them and keep them safe, keep them secret from humans, not because of any holy mission from God. But nope. Even though they use the darkness name and not the Satan name, the vampires still talk about following Satan and everything, and Armand even calls himself Satan's fool, just like he does in the book. But on the other hand, the question of whether or not Armand is or ever was Muslim hasn't been mentioned again once in this season, so maybe he was just pretending to be Muslim in season 1 to sell the lie of being Rashid? Well, that comes with a whole other can of worms. Armand tells Daniel that after 239 years of leading the cult and keeping discipline, he felt like he was failing. And we see him looking absolutely miserable and bored out of his mind as he sets a vampire on fire who broke the coven rules. He already knows the way of coven life is over and done with, and they are just shadows clinging to a meaningless past. And then Lestat shows up and confirms all that. In the book, Lestat was a vampire in Paris for months before he ever directly encountered any of the vampires from the cult. They stalked him, but were afraid of his extreme superpowers, since not only was he made by an old and powerful vampire Magnus, he also just got lucky and turned out to be a really, really strong vampire. The books imply that this may be because of his own personal inner strength as a character, that the stronger the person, the better vampire they come out. There are other examples of vampires made by super powerful ancients who come out weirdly weak. Armand tells Daniel that Lestat was sired by one of the coven's deserters, Magnus. Okay, a couple things wrong with this. First of all, the Vampire Chronicles never use the word sire for the creation of new vampires or those who create them. They only use the words made and maker. Anne Rice was very particular about these word choices. Second of all, Magnus was never a part of the religious cult. The cult does sometimes make new vampires to join its ranks, but most of the members of the cult are vampires who were forced into it and brainwashed. But Magnus was strong enough to always resist them, and he lived on his own in Paris for hundreds of years as a free rogue vampire, the cult's sworn enemy. He was not in any way religious. He was an alchemist, a man of science, who made himself a vampire by kidnapping one and draining its blood so that he could drink it on its own. But apparently, in the show now, he either was made by the cult instead, or they succeeded in brainwashing him into joining, at least for a while, before he somehow managed to get unbrainwashed enough to desert it. Armand tells Daniel that Lestat was something new, a presence he's never felt before, so of course he had to go stalk him down and investigate. He puts on some pants and shoes and a fancy hat and follows the Lestat trail to the theater where the Vampire Lestat is performing in a play. But this isn't the same theater as a Théâtre des Vampires we saw in the last episode. This is this huge glamorous opera house style theater. Is this supposed to be Renaud's House of Thespians? And then the vampire is switched to the smaller theater sometime later? But the little shabby theater already fit the book's description of it perfectly. Lestat was never involved in a big glamorous theater like this. The distinction between the boulevard theaters that took themselves too seriously and the comedy that he got to perform at Renaud's was a huge deal. Also, a theater of this caliber back then would never put on a play this lowbrow. And of course, the biggest thing, Lestat was an actor as a human. But when he became a vampire, he was never able to be an actor again. Becoming a vampire robbed him of that happy part of his life, and he tragically had to stay away from all his friends at the theater, including his boyfriend, Nikki. He just straight up ghosted them all because he couldn't let his new evil being taint their lives. At one point in the book, he does finally go back to the theater months after being a vampire and says hi to everyone. And then he goes out on the stage and starts doing all these weird acrobatics and jumping and shouting in ways that no human ever could do. They are all terrified of the inhumanness, and he realizes all the more that he can never be part of this world again, can never be in the spotlight again, will always have to lurk in the shadows, which is torment to his attention-whore soul. Being a vampire really is a curse for Lestat, who is desperate to be known. But apparently in the show, he doesn't have any of those problems at all. Becoming a vampire hasn't robbed him of anything. He is still performing on stage, not just that one time, but every single night, passing perfectly as human, and still has all his friends and his boyfriend Nikki with absolutely zero consequences. Generally, I've noticed that being a vampire among humans seems to come a lot easier for them in the show than it does in the books. All that loneliness and isolation and feelings of otherness are much less of a struggle, and this version of Lestat's doing just fine. As he watches the show, Armand is upset because he says Lestat's flaunting his vampire self in front of humans, which is against their laws because it risks their safety, which is what Lestat did in the book that one time with all those somersaults and cartwheels that freaked everyone out. But here, in the show, he's not actually doing that at all. The law is a vampire can't reveal his true nature to a mortal, but Lestat here is pretending to be human, and it's working out great for him. So Armand saying he was breaking that law makes no sense at all. Of course, Armand is probably just using that as an excuse to get up in Lestat's business because our boy here is absolutely smitten the second he lays his eyes on this sexy blonde demon, making everybody in the audience laugh and fall in love with him. Here, Lestat is performing a play of the Commedia dell'arte, which is that lowbrow style of theater that he does in the book. But in the book, he plays Lelio, the young, sexy, romantic lead character. Here, we see him playing the Harlequin character instead, the clown, the comic relief. The showrunners mentioned in one of their panels that the reason they switched the character he plays is because Lelio is boring, and they wanted to show something more fun and flashy on the screen. But it also makes sense. When Lestat was playing Lilio, he was this young, innocent mortal with no sense of the darkness of the undead. Once he became a vampire, he could never play that role again. So, since the show is having him still act instead of being forced to give that up, what it does instead is make him have to give Lilio up and switch to this trickster character, the demonic one, and no longer able to play the innocent romance. And Lestat sure looks like he's enjoying the hell out of it. Have you heard this story already? That at that same panel, the showrunner said that after they saw actor Sam Reed portray Harlequin with such energy and sparkle, they realized they would have to include in season 3 the plotline of Lestat becoming a rock star. Apparently they were previously considering maybe not doing that part of the story? Well, we can rest easy now. Thank you, Harlequin. Armand tells Daniel that he had to bring Lestat under his control by any means because Lestat was a heretic, and as a religious leader, it was Armand's job to convert him to the cult. Even as he's saying this, we can see that's just the flimsiest of excuses because he's already told us he's so over the cult and doesn't believe in it anymore. He just wants to control Lestat for, sexy reasons. In the book, Armand does not vibe with any of the other vampires at all. He's never felt that they were equals to him. And when Lestat shows up, it's finally like the first time he's ever met a vampire who could be his equal. He's so lonely and just needs someone to complete him. He gets Lestat's attention by speaking to him telepathically while he's on the stage, which Lestat takes in stride and then rejects Armand immediately. All of this is done in French, by the way. In the last episode, instead of having the characters in Paris speak English for the audience, while we understood that it would have been French that they were speaking, the show came up with repeated excuses for why everyone was speaking English, actually. But there is no possible reason for English to be used in these 1700 scenes, so the entire thing is in French. This is setting up an interesting precedent. Does that mean that all of season 3 of Lestat's backstory growing up in France will have to be in French too? I hope not. I get why the show thought it would be cool to have this whole flashback in French, but I kind of wish they didn't make that choice. Armand is telling the story out loud to Daniel, and I doubt he's speaking French when he dictates the dialogue to Daniel. He's translating it for him, so why can't we hear it in English too? I would be able to appreciate the actors' performances and the nuances of the characters and each word they're saying so much more if they were speaking a language that I know. Armand tries to tempt Lestat by promising to teach him all the vampire things that Magnus never did, and he says, "Come to me," twice, in French.
Viens à moi.
The same exact thing that Lestat psychically was saying to Louis when he lured him into becoming a vampire in the first episode of season 1. Also, the name of the song he wrote for Louis that he used to win him back after their separation in episode 6.
Yes.
Lestat got "come to me" from Armand? It has absolutely no effect on Lestat, though. He is not in the slightest bit interested. Armand stalks him for weeks with no luck. In the book, Armand's desperation to get Lestat to join the cult wasn't really about saving his soul or following God's orders for how vampires fit into his grand scheme. It was because if the other vampires in the cult saw how Lestat was living, not in mud under a cemetery covered in poop, going into churches without getting struck by lightning, they would realize the cult was just as much bullshit as Armand already knows it is, and they would abandon it, leaving him without a purpose in life. And he is desperate to cling to what he has and all he knows, so he has to get rid of this Lestat guy and the bad example he's setting one way or another. When recruiting him fails, he has to resort to more desperate measures, and we get to see a rendition of this in the show. Armand tells us that Lestat
Took a mortal lover.
Wait, what? Why is he describing Nikki like he was just some guy Lestat met in Paris one night as a vampire and started dating? In the book, Lestat and Nikki were childhood friends, reunited as adults, and they escaped to Paris together to pursue their artistic careers. As humans, they were a couple, but Lestat had to ghost him as soon as he became a vampire. I get that in the show, Lestat apparently didn't have to ghost anyone or give up his job as an actor, but is Armand telling us now that Nikki also didn't have any prior history with Lestat? Okay, this is all Armand's point of view, right? Maybe in this version, he can't read Lestat or Nikki's minds well enough to know the truth about their history. Or maybe he did, and he's just lying to Daniel for some reason. All of this could be lies as far as we know. And then in season 3, we'll get Lestat's point of view of how things really were, and 80% of Armand's story here will be discredited. We get to witness about 30 seconds of Lestat and Nikki's relationship dynamic. They're more romantic than they are in the book at first, and it does actually seem like the beginning of a love affair, with Nikki still worried about getting in trouble for the gay, and Lestat being like, bring it. Then we get to the good stuff, with some snarky insults from Nikki while he's chugging down the wine. Now this is how they were in the books. Nikki, the dark cynic, and Lestat, the sunshine optimist, just two human boys with their entire futures before them. But since Lestat's already a vampire now instead, he's got none of that innocent boy personality for Nikki to be reacting to, so his snark here seems kind of unmotivated. But we don't get much time to think about it. Like I said, 30 seconds and then whoosh! A wild Armand has entered the game. Book-wise, the first time Armand makes an appearance to Lestat, Nikki is absolutely not there with him at all, of course, since Lestat ghosted him months ago. Lestat is being chased by the children of Satan and hides in Notre Dame Cathedral, and then Armand sneaks in after him, revealing that he doesn't believe any of the Christian rules himself, but still tries to recruit Lestat. It ends up turning into something of a fight, but Lestat wins and escapes, so Armand then resorts to kidnapping Nikki and using him as bait to lure Lestat in. But this time, there's no church involved, and Nikki gets to watch the whole thing. Armand tries to explain to Lestat that he'll only be forever lonely, trying to find love with humans, and he should come live with his own kind. But Lestat's like, ew, no, you guys are dirty and have no fashion sense. Clothes and luxuries are more important than being with people who get me, I guess. This is a much simplified and cheapened version of his reasoning in the book. Again, Armand is the one telling us this story, so he could be completely lying to Daniel, making Lestat look shallow and stupid on purpose. In the book, a big reason for Lestat not wanting to join them was because he liked humanity. Yes, he would never truly fill his loneliness with mortals, but he felt more like them than he felt like a monster. He was an unwilling devil, revering humans and still wanting to be as close to them as he could. And when he tries to impress upon Armand the value of appreciating humanity, Armand is like, no, vampires only. Though, really, inside, he's triggered by how much Lestat reminds him of his old maker, Marius. Besides being tall and hot and blonde and wearing red robes, Marius also loved humanity and lived among mortals, passing himself off as a human. This was the way he raised Armand to be as a vampire too, and this was robbed from Armand when the cult brainwashed him. So inside, Armand is scared and uncomfortable and clinging to what he thinks he can try to control. This time, when their encounter turns into a fight, Armand uses some telekinetic power on Lestat that he absolutely does not have in the book. He freezes time, making everyone on the street stop, and throws Lestat around with his mind, thoroughly trouncing him. In the book, Lestat's the physically stronger one, and he beats Armand every single time. That's why Armand has to resort to kidnapping Nikki. But here, Armand wins, beats Lestat, and then kidnaps Nikki anyway. Lestat was right there. Why didn't you just kidnap him instead? You had him pinned and prone, because that wouldn't be dramatic, okay? The scene cuts to the cult's lair, which in the book is under the cemetery Les Moissons, but here could be anywhere. Nikki is chained to the vampire execution slab, covered with bite wounds. In the book, he was in a cage on top of this huge funeral pyre, torches at the ready to light it. Vampires chanting and singing when dancing, playing these eerie kettle drums with this terrifying music. But since in the show, Armand has the fire gift this time and could just set Nikki on fire with his mind, they don't need the cage or the pyre, and the vampires are just sitting around quietly in a much more budget-friendly arrangement. Lestat stomps into the lair, carrying a crucifix with his most blasphemous swagger, and here we get to see a very condensed version of a scene straight out of the book. I really hope we get to see the full version of this scene when Lestat gets his turn to tell his story the right way. First of all, this time Lestat's been alone this whole while. Armand has completely omitted from his story that Lestat's mother, Gabrielle, was with him and already a vampire during all of this. But Armand never liked Gabrielle, so of course he edits her right out of his story for Daniel and sums up Lestat's whole speech to his coven in the most trite way possible, making Lestat look completely cruel and without any compassion at all. Also, note how the character of Alessandra I told you about in episode 8 is missing from this scene as well. I called it! They gave all her lines to Daciana in Romania, so they couldn't have her be here again, and now Lestat never gets to hear her wisdom and philosophies. Armand sits back and lets Lestat show the other vampires that God holds no power over them. And since they cut out the Notre Dame part in the show, he uses this crucifix, which wasn't in the book at all, as a representation of that instead. Shows them that they can do whatever they want and live how they want without any fear of ever getting punished because the crucifix is just dead wood and God doesn't exist. And this is the age of enlightenment and everyone should be an atheist, really, or all the cool kids will make fun of you. Armand tells Daniel that the reason he let Lestat destroy his coven is because he'd known for half a century already that the cult was total bullshit. But if he tried to tell his followers this himself, they wouldn't have believed him, so he needed Lestat to be the one to do it. Oh, instead of telling the vampires about the values of humanity, this Lestat tells them that they are all the gods, actually, which aligns with how his character was changed in season 1, how superior this version of Lestat feels to humans instead of cherishing them. He then picks up the unconscious Nikki, easily snapping the chains, so badass, and walks on out of there. Armand tells Daniel that all the vampires quit the cult and went off frolicking in the streets to try to live like Lestat, but most of them couldn't hack it and they all went mad and killed themselves. Armand is definitely lying to Daniel here, right? In the book, Armand was so upset that Lestat ruined his cult. Yes, he knew it was bullshit, but it was his bullshit, and he wanted to keep it, that he kills all the ruined vampires himself. After Alessandra throws herself on the bonfire, Armand grabs all the other vampires and throws them on after her. Only 4 of them escape and run off into the streets, and they survive just fine. But Armand here wants Daniel to think he's the good one, the benevolent cult leader who wanted to set his children all free, actually. And oh, it's just so sad they couldn't hack it. But Armand's the nice one, the good boyfriend for Louis. It's only Lestat who is ever the dickwad. Uh-huh. Sure, Armand. Armand tells Daniel that the only way he kept from committing suicide himself was by sticking with the cult rituals, the ones that he knew were bullshit. Yeh. And then he says the same thing to Lestat as he does in the book, that Lestat could never understand what he's destroyed. So did he want the cult to end or not? Lestat walks in on him and asks Armand to teach him how to do all those cool vampire power tricks, how to freeze time and telekinetically toss people around and make fire with his mind. Armand just scoffs, so Lestat turns on the charm and starts seducing him, drinking his blood and letting Armand drink from him. This is very different from the book. First of all, Lestat didn't need to learn any vampire powers from Armand at all. He figured them all out on his own. He is an excellent vampire, okay? Second of all, he was afraid of Armand and avoided him after destroying the coven. Until one night, Armand stalks into a ball and hypnotizes Lestat into thinking they could be in love. Lures him in and then chomps down, bite raping him and drinking Lestat's blood to try to get all of Lestat's extra superpowers for himself. But then Lestat kicks the shit out of him and makes Armand puke up all his blood. He's about to chop off Armand's head with a sword, but then Armand gives him the Puss in Boots eyes, and Lestat is such a sucker for sad, dark-haired French boys that he scoops Armand up and carries him home. Yeah, he never would have just given Armand his blood willingly, and Armand has never given his blood to anyone in his life, so he would not tolerate Lestat just like walking up and biting him like this. Vampires in this universe don't just go around biting each other casually like it's a form of making out or something. It's a huge deal that only happens in very special circumstances. Here, they are exchanging blood 30 seconds after being alone together. Armand knows that Lestat made Nikki a vampire. In the book, he had to do it to save Nikki's life after the children of Satan drained and tortured him, but it's unclear if it was the same here. Armand can also tell that Nikki turned out wrong. In the book, this is because Nikki's mind and spirit were so broken by the torture that his inner cynical darkness destroyed his psyche when he became a vampire. Just like the book, though, Lestat is optimistic and hopes Nikki will get over it, defiantly telling this to Armand. Then, instead of going back to Nikki and trying to nurture him back to health like he does in the book, Lestat just starts making out with Armand, because apparently all he really cares about here is seducing Armand into teaching him those cool vampire tricks. This sexy exchange gives Lestat an idea, and he brings Armand back to the theater, where he's performing as Harlequin again. Here, he basically tells Armand the whole premise of the Théâtre des Vampires, vampires pretending to be humans, pretending to be vampires as a way to get away with murder on stage. Okay, so now, instead of this all being Nikki's dark and twisted idea from a shattered soul that Lestat was repulsed by, it's Lestat's idea? So he actually is the co-founder of the theater? And the other co-founder isn't Nikki, but is Armand? Armand is just so lonely and desperate to be loved that he goes along with this idea with the few surviving coven members, and he and Lestat establish the Théâtre des Vampires at this grand opera house place. And instead of leaving immediately after the theater is established like he does in the book, Lestat stays with the theater, performing the woodcutter play we saw Santiago do in the last episode with Lestat in the role of Death. Armand is lying about all of this, right? Right? He's gotta be, right? It's just that this is so entirely the opposite of what Lestat wants in the book. He was completely against making a mockery of humans on stage and killing in the theater. He thought it was petty and turned his back on Nikki and Paris because of it. Well, Armand says that Lestat's now the petty one, I guess, and we see him and the other vampires brutally slaughter all the other actors on stage so they can take it over. We cut to 3 months later, and Lestat is already bored with pretending to be Death on stage and has taken on Armand's role we saw last episode, the director up in the balcony, observing with detachment. Only this time, Armand is right at his side, gushing over how amazing Lestat is. He is so in love. But still, all Lestat wants is for Armand to teach him his secret vampire powers. He tells Armand he wants to have sex right there in the audience, and Armand's like, but Nikki's watching us? And wow, he is. Instead of being the playwright and mastermind on stage, this Nikki is still stuck in the orchestra pit playing the violin, all of his diabolical glory going to Lestat instead. But Lestat's like, fuck Nikki, he's so over this guy. He just wants that mind gift, so he convinces Armand that he's in love with him and drags him down to the floor and uses sex to manipulate him into sharing his powers. Then, as soon as he learns them, he leaves Paris without a word, ditching Armand and Nikki completely, leaving Armand shattered and heartbroken, and he tells Daniel that he was never able to say I love you to anyone again until he met Louis. Wow, only 3 months with Lestat and then you were ruined for all other men for 150 years? Damn. Daniel's like, okay, but what does this have to do with how you hide from Google? Daniel! That's the whole gist of the theater of the vampires, existing right under the public's nose and having them be so desensitized to the idea of vampires that they will never believe they're real, no matter how much evidence they're presented with. Louis is awake now, and he comes in to comfort the sad Armand and his heartbroken memories. He's heard this story before and knows all about Armand's history with Lestat and Armand's version of what a selfish, lying manipulator Lestat was, only using Armand for his powers and then leaving him flat. Daniel calls him a raging narcissist. Oh my god, Season 3 can't get here fast enough. Justice for Lestat! This is not how it went at all, Armand, you little gremlin with your sad boy lies! I already told you in my last video how Lestat really felt about Armand back then, so I won't get into all of it again, but seriously, And we thought Louis was coloring the truth to make Lestat look worse than he was. Armand is just out here straight up writing erotic friend fiction. Back into Louis' story. Claudia's been working at the theater for weeks now, and as she gets ready for work one night, he and Claudia are going over the details of their cover story to keep convincing the theater vampires that their maker was Bruce, and they totally did not kill him. Not at all. When Louis asks her what Bruce looks like, she grosses him out by telling him about all the moles he had on his crotch that she saw while he was raping her, and then mentions that Bruce kept her prisoner under floorboards for weeks. Oh, wow. So it wasn't just that he raped her that night by the fire and then left. Her sexual assault trauma was so much worse. Louis apologizes for triggering her, but he's seriously stressed out about them getting caught for lying about their maker, as he has every right to be. They haven't been told yet about the one crime among vampires, but he knows they'll be in huge trouble if anyone figures out they rose up against their beloved theater founder, Lestat. They are interrupted by Armand, who comes by for a visit, dressed in all white. Claudia is downright obsequious with him, calling him master and immediately bowing when he reprimands her for daring to look him in the eye. He calls her puce, the French word for flea, in a derogatory way. Louis just stands there and lets it all happen because he knows it makes Claudia feel included, abused and dominated, just like all the coven vampires. Just what she wants. She's so happy. Once they're alone, Armand looks at Louis' photographs and asks Louis to let him tag along while he goes out to take his people pictures on his nightly walks. We cut to the theater, where we see Santiago doing the woodcutter play again, with a new victim this time. Claudia is listening from backstage, absolutely enwrapped by Santiago's brilliance. But just as Santiago gets to the no pain part of the monologue, the vampire Estelle sneezes and ruins the moment. When Santiago rants at her for it afterwards, she says she sneezed because it's hay season.
It's hay season.
So she has allergies? A vampire with allergies? This is absolutely not a thing in the books. Vampires have perfect health all the time. They can't get sick or catch any diseases. Allergens have no effect on them, and they absolutely never need to sneeze. When they cry, their noses do get runny and they have to blow their nose. Their snot is tinted with blood, so it's especially gross. This is why vampires always carry hankies. A lot of crybabies, they all are. Otherwise, yeah, no sneezing. I wonder if this is setting up for something. Is this Chekhov's sneeze? Why change this essential vampire lore in this way unless it was for some interesting reason? Curious. The vampire Samuel Barclay, takes Claudia down to the basement vault he calls the wet room to teach her how they dispose of their nightly bodies, which is by feeding them to rats who devour all the flesh off them, then tossing their bones into the sewers. Paris has an especially famous sewer system and catacombs running under the entire city, as you may know. Shout out to all of my Phantom of the Opera and Les Miserables people. There's an access gate right into the sewer tunnels in the theater's basement. How handy. This is a surprise tool that will help us later. None of this is in the books, of course. While Louis does go back to the theater alone to chat up Armand, Claudia never goes anywhere near it again, well aware of how much danger she's in. Not just for killing Lestat, but also for being a child vampire, which is also against the rules. You know, for practical reasons, because only an absolute moron would make a defenseless child into a vampire. But now that Louis is the one avoiding the theater instead, he has to have his Armand time in other ways. We cut back to the two of them, where he's doing just what Armand asked, showing him where he goes at night. Armand is wearing different clothes, so it must be another night. Louis talking to him as if this is the first time he's showing him this, so I guess when Armand asked,
Show me where you go at night.
Louis was like, sure, but not right now. We'll do it tomorrow? You got me all excited by showing us Armand in an all-white outfit. Usually, when you see vampires wearing all white, it only means one thing. That white ain't staying white very long. Tease. Armand tells Louis that the coven says he is mad in love with humanity. Derogatory. Loving humanity? just does not compute for these vampires. Yes, this is exactly what sets Louis apart from the other girls in the book. Armand keeps gently trying to recruit Louis into joining the coven, but Louis tells him he's wasting his time. In the book, Armand never tried to get Louis to join the coven. He immediately saw Louis as his own ticket out of the coven. Armand was so sick of them and had only been staying with the coven all these years because he was waiting for Lestat to come back to him. But since when Lestat does come back, all he wants is Armand's blood to heal his burns, Armand locks him in a dungeon and goes after Louis instead. If he can have Louis all for himself, then he has absolutely no use for the coven anymore. Here, this Armand seems to actually want to keep the coven. And now he's faced with the exact same situation Lestat put him in back in the 1700s. The coven is getting squirrely, wondering why they have to follow rules and curfews, but Louis doesn't. It puts Armand at risk of losing control of them, losing everything, which apparently he still cares about this time, even though there's a whole entire Louis right there in front of him. But Louis like, that's your problem, not mine. I'm free, baby. Oh, Louis. How well do you really think that's going to go for you when 14 extremely dramatic vampires are already jealous of your freedom? But hold that thought, because Lestat is here! Armand's been referencing Bruce a couple times, and this has triggered Dreamstat to emerge in Louis' imagination. He managed not to think of him at all for 5 months, but after reading that letter last episode, the hauntings are back. Yes! And as Armand opens up about his feelings for Louis, his inner Lestat derides and degrades everything Armand is saying. A reflection of Louis' own trust issues. This time, Lestat is wearing the outfit from the night when he made Louis a vampire, the night of their wedding vows in the church. But in defiance of him, Louis starts flirting with Armand, and it makes Dreamstat disappear. Back in Dubai, Daniel is distracted from the conversation when he gets a DM on his laptop from Raglan James, reminding him of the Talamasca files he dumped on his laptop. And he tries to discreetly look at them. He's overwhelmed by the sheer massive amount of information that explodes all over his screen. It's absolutely everything there is to know about Louis and Armand, everywhere they've been in their lives, and any other vampires even remotely connected to them. It goes by in a flash, but one of the windows is the Armand file as the Paris Coven leader, and we learn a few new tidbits of information about him. We knew his birth name couldn't be Andrei anymore since he's not Russian in this version, but according to this file, he's now from Delhi, India, and his name was Arun. We also see the Talamasca has folders on his past from before he became a vampire. There's one called Renaissance Brothel Overview, and one called Forced Prostitution Venice. We'll talk more about his backstory next time, but he was only a sex slave in a brothel for a very short time in Venice before Marius rescued him. Yet, the Talamasca has made 2 whole separate folders about it. Also, a folder for Renaissance portraiture painted by Marius de Romanos. Would love to see those paintings. Hold up! What's this? Nicky's folder, Nicolas de Lefont, is dated 1780 to 1882? Yeah, Nicky looked younger than Lestat here, but Lestat was born in 1760, so he was 20 years older than Nicky? And that means that Nicky was only supposed to be 16 years old here in this scene? I would say maybe it's just supposed to be the date he became a vampire, since in the book that was 1781, but they have him here in 1796 still human. Also, it says he died in 1882? So, he stayed a vampire almost 100 years. In the book, he only made it 10 years before he took his own life, with Armand's help and encouragement. But maybe it's just another typo? Talamasca, you need to hire better interns. Louis notices his distraction, and when Daniel flounders to explain it, Louis looks suspicious. But Daniel diverts the conversation back to Claudia, and we see her bonding with Santiago backstage at the theater. He gives her acting advice and tells her some of his backstory, that he used to be a Shakespearean actor in London named Francis Naughton. I can see why he changed his name to Santiago. Frank the Vampire just doesn't have the same ring to it. He died while he was playing Hamlet, hence the bleach blonde hair, but he was most famous for playing Iago in Shakespeare's Othello. So Santiago was the natural choice of a name for him, I guess. Claudia assumes Armand was his maker because despite having only been a vampire for 20 years, the youngest in the whole coven, he's the strongest of them and can fly when no one else can. But he tells her that his maker was some other strong elder vampire, but he's no longer with them because Armand killed him and buried him in the basement wall vaults. He doesn't tell us why yet, but he deserved it, apparently. None of this is Santiago's backstory in the book, because he has no backstory in the book. We learn absolutely nothing about him. So it's a lot of fun that the show is using this opportunity to flesh him out and turn him from this one-note villain character into such a compelling and complex person. Before they part, Santiago once again hints that he thinks Claudia is lying about her maker. But he does it in a fun way, not seeming to mind at all. Because they're friends now. He's the only one who lets her look him in the eye. Besties! Surely she can trust him, tell him anything, and he'll always have her back. We'll see how that works out for her. Next, we see Louis and Armand on a date in a jazz bar, smoking and discussing philosophy. Remember how I told you that the show completely cut out the deep philosophical conversation they have the first night Louis comes to the theater, and it blows Louis' mind and shatters his entire worldview? Well, it's not gone entirely. It's been moved here. This is a much condensed version of their talk in the book, but the gist of it is the nature of evil. Louis says that because he is evil, a killer, it doesn't matter that sometimes he eats animals or tries to be a nicer vampire. He is just as evil as the rest of them. Armand argues that if that's true, then humans would only ever have to do one bad thing in their life and they're automatically as evil as everyone else. No, he believes in gradations of evil, or maybe that there's actually no such thing as evil at all. Instead of letting us see the fascinating way this conversation goes in the book and the huge impact it has on Louis' philosophies, they are interrupted by none other than Jean-Paul Sartre himself, who spouts his own philosophy of evil, then asks them to please shut up so he can hear the jazz piano play. Armand doesn't mind. They are old buddies, apparently. So did Sartre hear the whole thing with them talking about being vampires, and he's just chill with it? That means Armand's broken the law about revealing their nature to a human and letting him live. Armand! They switch to carry on their conversation telepathically, but Louis is very quickly distracted, tuning Armand out because Lestat is back! This time, the piano player has turned into Dreamstat, and now it's him serenading them with jazz. He sings a parody version of his song, Come to Me, reprimanding Louis for being interested in the far inferior Armand, who could never love him like Lestat did. And considering these are all just Louis' own thoughts he's telling himself, yeah, valid. Armand reads all this in Louis' mind, of course, and challenges him to admit the truth.
How long are we going to play games, Louis?
So Louis finally tells him that his maker wasn't Bruce. It was, dun dun dun, Lestat. Of course, Armand already knew this, has known it for months. Louis thinks it's just because Armand's really good at reading his mind, but if the show follows the books, we know it's because Lestat came to Armand first and told him about his fledgling Louis. Then Armand went out and found Louis because of that. Louis is upset by having to admit what he did to Lestat, and suddenly Dreamstat is right there at the table with him, goading and insulting Armand, Louis' inner conscience trying to tell him that Armand is bad news and to stay away. Louis asks Armand if he has to kill him now, and when Armand doesn't give him an answer, Dreamstat goads him further until finally Louis explodes, screaming out loud to him, to the confusion of everyone in the restaurant who only see him talking to air. In the face of Louis' hysteria, Armand remains completely calm and composed outwardly, trying to talk him down, which is very much how he behaves in the books. Though inwardly, he's probably going through all kinds of feelings. Maybe fear that he's ruined his chances with Louis, or maybe triumph that he's hooked him further. Could be anything going on under that creepy porcelain doll face of his. Louis storms out and goes back to the gay hookup park, while we hear the music from season 1 that underscored his hysterical run to the church when Lestat was overwhelming his mind the night he made him a vampire. In the park, Lestat reappears, still wearing the very clothes from that night. They make out furiously, then Lestat says the best line in the whole episode.
Kill me again. Go on. Kill me again. Show me. The only way you know how to love.
Ugh. Louis never told Lestat I love you back, season 1. As he bashes Lestat's head against the wall, Lestat is laughing, delighted to have successfully gotten Louis to give into his extreme emotions, revealing how much Louis is truly not over him in the slightest. Then, once it's finished, Louis realizes that it was a different man the entire time, some random guy from the park who he just slaughtered, and he leaves the body right there for anyone to find, like the self-destructive, eternal sad sack he is. Back home, he's sobbing while trying to distract himself by developing the photo he took of Armand. But his mind is still playing tricks on him, and the image of Lestat emerges on the photograph. He fights to get a grip on himself before Claudia can see how much pain he's in, and once his mind is clear, the image is now just Armand, who stares up at him from the water in judgment, or is it understanding? But Claudia insists they do their nightly lie practice, getting their story straight about Bruce again. She pauses to express how she's upset that Lestat didn't tell them how great the coven in Paris was, but instead told her that the vampires out there are vicious. Dude, he was telling the truth. You're in danger, girl. She says that meeting Bruce did make her think Lestat was right about other vampires for a while, and then things turn dark as she begins to recount to Louis more of what happened to her with Bruce. It's interesting that Louis is telling Daniel this story now, when previously he'd ripped out the pages of Claudia's diaries where she wrote about this herself. He refused to let Daniel read about her rape trauma in her own words, but he can tell him this version now. Well, the showrunners told us that the events of season 1, episode 5 would be revisited this season, and here it is. We actually get to see how Claudia was affected by her sexual assault, insight into how she's surviving since it happened, and how it colors her relationship with Louis. So, yeah, Bruce kidnapped her and kept her prisoner for weeks underneath these floorboards, assaulting her repeatedly and constantly telling her he loved her the whole while he did it. But she was just so depressed that one night he said he'd had enough of her gloomy face and let her go. So that's when she went home to get Louis. Of course, none of this happened to her in the book, right? But it does remind me a bit of another vampire from the books. In the 10th book in the series, Blood and Gold, there's an actual 14-year-old girl vampire that Marius meets in ancient Constantinople. She tells him the story of how she was kidnapped and made by the vampire Cyril, who kept her prisoner and was rough with her for years before one day he just gets tired of her lack of enthusiasm and just leaves her to fend on her own. Much less extreme than Claudia's version, but the parallels are there. Before Louis can react to Claudia's horrifying story, she changes the subject and asks if he'll come support her when she gets inducted to the theater coven. He was just about to tell her that Armand knows the truth about Lestat, but now he just feels so horrible about everything that he promises to come and never tries to mention it again. All he wants is for her to be happy. Some way. Somehow. In Dubai, real Rashid, who Daniel is finally just calling Rashid, interrupts the interview to take Louis and Armand out for a Zoom call with someone who wants to buy one of their artworks. While they are busy on that call, Daniel uses the chance to look through the Talamasca files on his computer. One of the windows contains folders of all the theater coven members, and we get to see a few of their last names. Santiago's new last name is Windsor, because of course it is. Though in the books, most vampires in the world never have, need, or use last names at all and are just fine without them. The real kicker is that Armand now has a last name. In the books, vampires use fake names all the time, human aliases, but Armand never used a real last name for himself. Armand, until the 2010s when he, needed one to get by in the modern world. He's then called Armand Leroux, which is just French for Armand the Russian, because he's Russian. Yeah. Vampires apparently suck at being creative with their own last names. The last name that Marius comes up for himself is Marius de Romanos, which just means Marius of Rome, because, he's from Rome. Keep it up, guys. You're brilliant. But here, Armand's last name is Marius. I get why it's not Leroux, because he's not Russian in this version. Apparently, during his time at the theater, Armand took Marius as his last name. Not Marius's last name. He's not Armand de Romanos, and he's not Armand de Marius. either. Nope, just Armand Marius. This isn't a surprise to us because we saw photos of the theater filming location from Prague last summer that showed posters for the plays with Armand Marius on the byline. After these photos started spreading around online, a curious thing happened. The next day, when new fans took new photos at that location and sent those out, the name Marius had been blacked out on the posters. My guess at the time was that they thought to have him go by Armand Marius because, as a theater guy, he would need a last name, right? But then after the props were printed, they changed their mind on that for some reason. They were like, nah, don't like that. He's still just Armand. But they missed a few. We see one of those posters in the background of episode 2 where he's still listed as Armand Marius. And now, here on Daniel's computer, the Talamasca are calling him that too, except they spell it Marius. Marius? Is that just a typo? Come on, Talamasca, sloppy, you're better than that. Marius. Daniel opens up a folder with newspaper articles about the theater and sees that one reveals the theater burnt down in the Great Fire of 1949. Ooh, foreshadowing. Now, if you've read the book or seen the movie, you know just how and why the theater burns down. But the interesting bit here is that date, 1949. We know from Claudia's diary in season 1 that she and Louis arrived in Paris in November of 1945. Then they got involved with the theater in April of 1946, and then just lived there like that for 3 more years? In the book, the time between when they meet the theater and then it burns down is only like a couple months at most. And as I've said, Armand was keeping Lestat in this dungeon that whole time. So does that mean that Armand's kept him prisoner, starved, and tortured now for over 3 years? Oh my God, Lestat! Back into the story, it's Claudia's initiation night and Louis in the audience. While he's performing woodcutter, Santiago has a telepathic conversation with Armand, telling him that the entire coven agrees that since Louis refuses to join them and broke one of their laws by leaving that mutilated body in the gay park, he needs to die. So Armand reluctantly promises that he'll kill Louis himself after Claudia's ceremony. The music gets super tense and Santiago starts whispering, "No pain," to the victim on stage, but yikes, Armand is very much in pain. We know Armand doesn't want to do this. He's absolutely smitten with Louis, but it's 14 of them against him, and he's got no way out of this. And considering the last time we saw him, he didn't answer when Louis asked if he was going to kill him. I really think he might mean it, you guys. If he doesn't kill Louis, he's going to lose everything, just like when Lestat destroyed his entire existence in the 1700s. Louis is absolutely clueless as Claudia goes through her ceremony, which involves Armand showing her a mechanical flea circus toy as a metaphor for her growth. Get it? Because they were calling her Flea before, but now she's one of them, a flea no longer. No, this whole flea circus thing is not in any way connected to the books. I think the show just thought it was a cool visual. Louis is not allowed to watch the rest of the ceremony, so Armand takes him down into the basement gate to go for a walk through the sewers. So romantic. If it was good enough for the Phantom of the Opera, it's good enough for Armand. Meanwhile, Santiago reads Claudia the 5 laws of the vampire coven, which, as far as they're concerned, are the 5 laws of all vampires everywhere, whether they like it or not, and the coven authorizes itself to destroy any vampire who ever breaks them. Law 1 is only the coven master is allowed to make new vampires. Law 2 is no severely disabled people or children are allowed to be vampires, just because they couldn't survive without someone else constantly taking care of them, and that's just cruel. Well, it's a good thing no one's ever actually broken that law in this version of the story. Law number 3 is no vampires are ever allowed to write about vampires. This is the law Louis is currently breaking in Dubai as we speak that Armand is afraid he'll get killed for. Law number 4 is the old one we mentioned before. Don't break the masquerade. Never let humans know vampires are real. And if you do, you have to kill the human immediately. Law number 5 is the big one. No vampire may ever destroy another vampire unless it's the coven master doing it to punish a vampire who broke one of these laws. Which is exactly what Armand is up to with Louis as we speak. Even though in the book, Santiago tells Claudia that the only crime among their kind is to kill another vampire, all these These other rules do still exist in canon, and vampires can and do get destroyed for breaking them throughout the entire series. They're not like numbered and formalized this way though in the books. That's all the show's doing. Once Claudia nervously agrees to abide by all the laws, the vampires celebrate with a blood orgy, all biting each other and drinking from each other. This is not a thing they ever do in the books, but hey, it makes for sexy TV. Speaking of sexy, in the sewer tunnels, Louis is still feeling weird about how he left Armand that other night, knowing he's in trouble for killing Lestat, not even realizing the coven wants him dead for completely different reasons. He tells Armand that he'll flee Paris so that he won't be a problem for them anymore, but Armand points out that that just means he would cause problems for other covens wherever he went. He's a rogue vampire. And those just straight up aren't allowed. This is why Lestat moved to America. As Armand lights his hand on fire and tells Louis he's going to disappear his body into the river, Louis accepts that he's about to die. He asks Armand not to burn him, just to cut off his head, please, instead. And then he also asks Armand to look after Claudia for him. But Armand shocks him by telling him that Claudia will probably be killing herself very soon. Because she was made so young, at 14, she won't be able to survive as a vampire much longer, mentally. Even though Louis doesn't want to believe it, we then see a gruesome suggestion that Armand might be right, because back with the coven, they surprise Claudia by presenting her with this baby doll dress, saying that now that she's part of them, she's going to be acting on stage, playing a little girl every night of her life for the next 50 years. Oh, God. All of her dreams came true. Community, family, people who accept her for who she is on the inside and not how she appears. Shattered. Immediately after. Ugh, no pain? Yes, pain. Everyone is in pain. We see the shock and anguish on her face as it sinks in that she's not getting what she wants at all by joining the coven. No more sexy pink silk lady dresses for her, but instead is going to be forced to be triggered by her dysmorphia night after night after night for decades on end. Oh, my heart. Back to Louis. Armand is justifying why he has to die because, as Lestat said in season 1, they live in a savage garden. It is canon that Armand would know this quote. In the books, Lestat never actually said it to Louis, but instead it was part of his philosophical revelations back in the 1700s when he first met Armand. So deep, so profound. Armand's got his hand on fire again, but then says,
"Why isn't Louis? Those with the most power are often the weakest."
Because he is weak for Louis. So weak. And then, surprise! He's not going to kill Louis after all. You silly thing! He sure had you scared, didn't he? But nah. Even though the threat of the entire coven rising up against him is still very much real, Armand just says fuck it, and doesn't carry out his coven master duties at all. Can't wait to see what the repercussions of this is going to be. But since we know that they've got 3 more years together at this point, I'm guessing there doesn't actually end up being any consequences at all, at least for a very long time. So all that tension and fear of Louis thinking he was about to die was just a fake out. Armand takes Louis home and asks him if he's broken over Lestat. Louis says no, but he's still hurting, and he doesn't know if he can ever get over it. Then Armand rocks his world and tells him about his own painful history with Lestat, and how if he could get over it, then Louis can too. And then they finally have their first kiss. So romantic and bittersweet, as we know they're both hurting over Lestat on the inside, but maybe they can heal each other. That's what they want us to think happened with them in Dubai, right? Then, because he's a vampire and needs to be explicitly invited inside, no, that's not a thing in this universe at all, Louis invites Armand up to his apartment so they can have sex. None of this happens in the books, of course. The romance of their relationship is entirely cerebral, not at all physical. But I am here for it. The show told us from the start that they were going to make the subtext text, and to them, that means lots of kissing on screen. Yes! More queer interracial kissing on TV. More! Let men be men. No sex, though, of course. This is AMC, you guys. We're on basic cable here. The episode ends as they go inside, leaving the audience to just imagine what happens next. And surely write plenty of fan fiction about it on AO3. Give it like 3 or 4 days, guys. Don't worry. And I'm sure all those gaps will be filled in for you. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and damn it, I did it again. This video is even longer than the last one. But that's because we're talking about Lestat, and is there any more important thing to talk about in this world? I hope you learned a lot, and I gave you a lot to think about. I'm sure you have questions. Ask me your questions about the book and show in the comments, and I will give you all the answers. Please also join me on Patreon to help support the making of these videos. The link is in the description. There's also an orange button over the credits. You just have to press it. I joked last time that my video was going to make tens of dollars on YouTube. That was actually an exaggeration. YouTube pays pennies. Patreon is where it's at, and I could not keep making any of these videos at all for you without my patrons' funding. I love you. Thank you all so much. I miss my vampire coffee. I need to get another snack to share with you next time. We'll be together again next week. Until then, good night.